"You're not family, so just stick to being a maid." I was invited to my brother-in-law's son's celebration. But since I'm not family, I was told not to take a seat. A daughter-in-law who can't have kids is just useless. This isn't the first time my mother-in-law has blamed us for not having children. However, what comes next is an unexpected truth. I am Rachel, 30 years old. Even after getting married, I continued working as an office worker. My husband is 33 years old, and we have been married for 4 years but do not have children. We weren't actively trying for children, but there was a time when we were conscious about it. Yet we haven't been fortunate enough to conceive. Wondering if there might be a problem. After some investigation, it turns out that my husband has issues that make it difficult for us to conceive. My husband has asked me not to tell his parents that he is the reason we can't have children. After more discussions, we decided not to seek treatment and instead wait to conceive naturally. The chances are slim, so there's a high likelihood that it will always be just the two of us. Someday, we might be forced to investigate why we can't have children and to disclose the results. But we've decided to think about it when and if that happens. Little did I know that this decision would mark the beginning of a hellish ordeal. My mother-in-law, in her late 50s, is convinced the reason we don't have children is that there's something wrong with me. She tells me to quit my job and focus on conception, suggesting that I'm refusing to be intimate with my husband. This leads to insults being hurled my way. Text messages keep coming like, "It's your fault we don't have kids. We don't need a useless daughter-in-law," and "Do you want to embarrass my son?" Initially, I replied with "I'm sorry," but as the frequency increased, I stopped responding, which led to phone calls. The content is the same, but I can sense malice in the voice. The calls are timed for when my husband is not around, although not as frequent as the messages. The sound of my mother-in-law's voice lingers uncomfortably. Yet, since I only see my mother-in-law about twice a year, I chose to endure it. Gradually, however, the stress began manifesting as physical symptoms. One day, my brother-in-law's son won a prize in a painting competition, and the celebration was held at my in-laws. All the relatives were gathering, so we had no choice but to follow suit. It takes 2 hours by car to reach my in-laws. I feel pain throughout my body, so spending 2 hours in a car is honestly tough. Moreover, facing my mother-in-law adds to the dread. Ideally, I would prefer not to go, but my relationship with my brother-in-law and his wife is good. And I do find their son adorable. Indeed, both my husband and I have been fond of him. Thinking I could manage if I alternated driving with my husband, I decided to go. But just before we were due to leave, my husband ended up unable to join due to work. I drove alone, and he was to catch up using public transport, though I suggested waiting for him to finish work. He insisted it would be shameful for a couple to arrive late at such an occasion. Lacking professional manners, so I reluctantly went alone at the appointed time. When I arrived at my in-laws on time, no other relatives had yet arrived, and I was the first one there. However, upon seeing me, my mother-in-law immediately snapped, "You're late." Entering, I saw that nothing had been prepared for the celebration. Only the materials that seemed to be used were left out. "Hurry up and prepare. We're running out of time." Shocked by her cold remark, I asked her to repeat herself. "It's obviously your job, isn't it? A daughter-in-law isn't a guest, so get on with it." It was as if she had left everything for me to do. Furthermore, my mother-in-law continued, "Of course, you've been a housewife for 4 years. So you should be able to tell at a glance what to make just by looking at the ingredients. Even a daughter-in-law who can't have children should at least know what the kid's like, right? And once again, she relentlessly attacked me over not having children. No matter how much I resisted, I had no power to fight back, so I silently started preparing. As preparations were nearing completion, relatives began to gather at the in-laws' house. My brother-in-law and his son arrived around the same time, and the son came into the kitchen. When he asked what I was making, I told him it was something he liked, and he smiled happily. Seeing his smile, even just a little, eased the pain caused by my mother-in-law's harsh treatment. However, my brother-in-law's wife was nowhere to be seen. Considering my mother-in-law's personality, she would likely complain about the wife of the eldest son not showing her face at a family gathering. Especially today, at her own son's celebration. It's puzzling that she's not here. Most of the preparations were complete, and almost all the relatives had arrived. Only my husband and sister-in-law were absent, so my mother-in-law suggested we start eating. I naturally tried to sit in an empty spot. However, my attempt was immediately stopped by my mother-in-law. "What are you trying to rest for, Rachel? Who will serve the food if you sit down? Come on, don't let the drinks or food run out." She told me to ensure that the food and drinks did not run out. Furthermore, I was instructed to respond to requests for dishes as needed. And to serve dessert at an appropriate time. Was there even dessert? Are they expecting me to make that too? Preparing desserts involves a lot of steps from scratch. Am I supposed to do that now? You mean you haven't prepared it? What a disgraceful daughter-in-law. Despite what was said, I had no choice but to obey my mother-in-law. If I protested here, she would surely proclaim in front of all the relatives gathered that the reason we can't have children is definitely my fault. I returned to the kitchen, started preparing the dessert, continued making more food so nothing would run out, and occasionally went around serving drinks. Then, some of the relatives began to say, "It seems unfair to rely only on Rachel." And a few women started to get up to help. But my mother-in-law sharply stopped them. "It's fine, Rachel is only useful for this sort of thing." Another relative asked, "What do you mean?" "Well, isn't it obvious? A daughter-in-law who can't bear children, she's just a nuisance." There was a moment of silence, making her next words resonate even more. "This barren daughter-in-law is useless. She's not family, just a troublemaker." I knew she was saying this because she knew I couldn't respond. I couldn't make a scene here. Though I held back from retaliating, I must have been glaring at her unintentionally. So scary. "What a look, you. All I'm doing is telling the truth. Among the relatives, you, Rachel, are the only wife who hasn't given birth." She sneered as if saying I was useless. Sensing a brewing storm due to her behavior, one of the relatives took the brother-in-law's son to another room. In front of the children, such a scene is indeed not suitable. But in front of the adults, I felt a slight surge of defiance. Just then, my husband, having finished his work, arrived. He entered with a cheerful tone, apologizing for his tardiness. But the atmosphere in the gathering was heavy and somber. And he seemed to notice something was off. He whispered to me, asking what had happened. I told him about the things my mother-in-law had said. Since other relatives were also present, it was clear that I wasn't exaggerating. And no one interrupted. After listening, my husband seemed to take my side a bit. He might even admit that he was the cause. After hearing everything, my husband confronted my mother-in-law, angrily telling her that she had gone too far and that there were things that were not acceptable to say. although my mother-in-law looked dissatisfied. She did not seem to want to argue back against my husband. This might keep her quiet for a while. I was hopeful, but the next words from my husband felt like a betrayal. In a voice only I could hear, he said, "Well, infertility is a fact. Try to understand the feelings of a mother who can't hold a grandchild of her own blood. Yes, infertility is a fact. But the cause is with him," and yet his tone was as if it was someone else's issue. I quietly retorted, "The cause of infertility is you, right? Why do I have to endure such unreasonable accusations when it's not my fault? If you're going to say that much, admit that the cause of infertility is you." "No, that's a bit. Look, there's the dignity and position of a man. You understand that, right? You're an office worker, so you understand a man's position." His voice was shrill, his demeanor flustered as he argued. Moreover, he made an appalling attempt to shift the blame. "After all, isn't pregnancy a woman's job? Don't just blame me when you're not doing your job as a woman." His assertion was loud and clear, prompting my mother-in-law to seize the moment to retaliate. "Blaming my son because you're useless? Really, what kind of daughter-in-law are you? I've never seen a daughter-in-law as shameless and audacious as you." She cursed me as much as she could. In the midst of this, with no relative daring to oppose her, my brother-in-law raised his voice. "Enough is enough." I was surprised that someone as mild-mannered as he could shout with such authority. "You've tormented my wife and now Rachel too. What has come of your bullying the daughters-in-law? You clearly haven't learned your lesson." I had wondered why my sister-in-law was not at this gathering, and now I understand. When I was dating my husband, my brother-in-law and his wife were living at my in-laws. However, the next time I visited, they were gone. And my husband told me they had moved due to my brother-in-law's circumstances. I thought my husband and I might end up living with my mother-in-law. But due to his job, we didn't discuss living together and settled in a new home 2 hours away by car from the in-laws. In front of all the gathered relatives, my brother-in-law spilled the beans about what had happened to his family. His wife had become pregnant soon after their marriage, and my mother-in-law was very happy about it. However, the baby was a girl, and my mother-in-law's attitude completely changed. "A girl means nothing. The wife of the eldest son should bear a male child. A daughter-in-law's worth is determined by her ability to produce male heirs. A girl will just end up in another man's house, so spending on her upbringing is a waste. You're a daughter-in-law, you should understand a woman's place, right?" Pressured by these twisted values, my sister-in-law became mentally unstable. The doctor who examined her advised starting by distancing herself from the cause. Seeing the situation as serious, my brother-in-law decided he could no longer endure it and left the family home. Some female relatives looked down, unable to even look at my mother-in-law. Perhaps they knew that my sister-in-law had been bullied in this house. Even witnessing it, they could not speak up against the formidable presence of my mother-in-law. With the reality of his wife's bullying revealed, my mother-in-law glared at my brother-in-law as if annoyed by his revelations. But he seemed unfazed and said, "Rachel, you can go home now. There's no reason for you to endure this any longer." My husband argued against deciding on his own but was silenced when blamed for not defending me. I handed the car keys to him and decided to return home using public transportation. I nodded briefly to the relatives and turned to leave. Then my brother-in-law came closer and whispered in my ear, "Rachel, you should take some time to think about the future." It was as if he was saying there was no need to endure any longer. And I felt incredibly relieved to be freed from all these burdens as I left my in-laws' house. I arrived home before my husband and began packing to leave the house. Naturally, I didn't forget to leave a divorce petition in place of a note. When my husband returned and saw the divorce petition, he seemed somewhat flustered. He reached out a few times, but after meeting only about twice, he began to say not to get so upset over a few words from his mother. I had been enduring daily phone calls and messages demanding a grandchild, and insulting me for not being able to conceive. Enduring all this only to be dismissed as not family. Hearing this, how could I continue as a family? When my husband joined my mother-in-law in treating me like the villain, my resolve won't change, so I told him to quickly sign the divorce petition and file it, then I hung up. My husband didn't understand why I was so adamant, sending frantic contacts and messages like a broken record. Of course, I ignored all of them. If he couldn't figure it out when I left him unread, I wanted to tell him to take a hint. After hearing that I wanted a divorce, my brother-in-law and his wife did everything they could to help me find a place to live. They helped in many other ways as well. Apparently, they had also decided to cut ties with my mother-in-law after what happened at that celebration. They stopped sending money to my mother-in-law, who was unemployed and not yet old enough to receive a pension and had been relying on her sons. She had some savings, but maintaining her standard of living without their help would be challenging, since my husband's income was lower than mine, and he had boasted of being able to send money home because I was supporting our living expenses with my salary. If our divorce was finalized, my husband, having to live on his salary alone, wouldn't be able to afford to send money to support his mother. Soon after we separated, the effects began to show, with both sons stopping their financial support. My mother-in-law had to lower her standard of living and live more modestly. However, someone as unaccustomed to frugality as my mother-in-law could not possibly manage. Succumbing to her desires, she accrued debt. And it won't be long before she loses her mortgaged house and land. My husband was also forced to live frugally. There had been several instances of my mother-in-law asking him for money. Unable to give what he didn't have, their mother-son relationship seemed quite strained. He was reluctant to agree to the divorce, but when I got a lawyer involved, it was settled surprisingly quickly. I learned through this ordeal that my ex-husband was weak when faced with authoritative figures. If I had known this earlier, I might have been able to resolve things differently. What was all that time I endured in vain? Now, I am enjoying a carefree life without the need to endure the physical ailments that had plagued me, brought on by what my mother-in-law had said, began to improve as soon as I started thinking I didn't need to endure anymore. While my husband was the reason for our difficulty in conceiving, I believe my mother-in-law was the primary cause. Now, I look forward to meeting someone with whom I can be family under any circumstances, and am enjoying my current freedom a little longer.